So now that our project is up and running, let's get familiar with the Moho interface. It might seem strange how things work in Moho at first, so let's do a quick rundown of the key panels and toolbars so we know what we're looking at. I've got one of the startup demo projects opened, so we have some example content to look at. First, the main thing is the stage in the middle here. This is where you'll draw your artwork and see your animation. There's some key things to understand along the bottom that will be important later. You have controls for playing back the animation and navigating it. And here you can mute or enable the audio during playback. And these options here let you have multiple views of your stage at the same time. This is mostly important when you're working in 3D. We'll look at that later. Then, very important to know about is the options here to show curves or not. When you're working with vector artwork on a vector layer, which we'll be doing a lot, this controls whether you can see the control points and curves that define a line or shape. Then, next to that is the display quality drop-down list. This controls what effects and visuals get rendered live here in the stage view. Ideally, you'll be able to keep this on high so that you can get a better idea of what your final scene will look like when you export. But if your computer is getting sluggish, especially when playing back your animation, you might need to come in here and turn some features off. Now, no matter how high you have the display quality settings, your stage view isn't going to be totally accurate. To see what a particular frame will look like in your final animation, you can go up to File, Preview, or just press Command or Control R, depending on if you're on Mac or PC. Then that will render the frame in its final state the way it will appear when you export the animation. Next, let's look at the Layers panel over here. This is where you manage all the individual elements that make up the scene. There are many different layer types that you can add that each bring their own functionality. We'll go over the different types of layers in another video. But something important to notice is that based on the layer type you have selected, the options over here in the Tools panel will change. This is because different layers work in totally different ways. For example, on an image layer, you'll have bitmap drawing tools, but if you have a vector layer selected, you'll have a bunch of vector drawing tools. And this is very important too. If you have the timeline on frame 0, you'll have more tools available. Frame 0 is where you want to create all your artwork. If you're past 0, you're in the middle of the animation and you're more limited in what you can change on the fly about your layers. Now, there are some tools that remain regardless of the layer type. These tools under the layer label are for moving and working with the layers themselves rather than the contents of the layers. We'll look at what that means later. Then there's the tools under Camera. Every scene has a virtual camera that can be modified with these tools. Notice the purple frame here. That's the bounds of what the camera is seeing. That's important for telling the difference between changing the camera with the camera tools and changing your workspace view with the workspace tools. These just change the view of your scene within the program to make it easier to see what you're doing, whereas the camera tools change what is actually going to be visible in the final animation. Now I want to reset this, which brings us up here to the Tool Settings toolbar. This will be different depending on what tool you have selected. There's a lot of important functionality up here. And also, just under that toolbar, there's a row of text that will give you important tips on how to use a tool, like what modifier keys like Alt or Command do. Now, when you're using any tool that creates artwork, the Style panel will be important. This is where you control things like your colors, your line width, your brush shape, and you can even add special effects. There's a lot of functionality in this panel that we'll go over in depth later. Next, down here is the timeline. This is where you control how the motion of your character and other artwork plays out. If I find a layer that has animation on it, you'll see there are keyframes for each property like position or rotation that are being animated over time. We'll of course be going over the timeline in depth and spending a lot of time here as we create our animation. Next, I wanted to point out one panel that isn't visible by default, but can be accessed with this button here. This is the library. This is for accessing artwork and assets you want to be able to reuse in different scenes. You'll see here is the custom content folder we set up before. There's no content in there yet, but below that, in the factory content library, you can see examples of the kind of things you might want to keep in the library, like props or sounds. You can just drag one of these over and add it to your scene. We'll look at how to save something you've made in the library later. I'll just use Command-Z to undo that. Lastly, there are a few additional panels you might need access to in specific situations. All the additional panels can be found up here in the Window menu. Like, for example, let's look at Keyframe window. Now currently it's a free-floating window, but any of these additional panels can also be docked as part of the regular interface. You just go back to the Window menu and go to Docking, and here you can check or uncheck whether that panel should appear free-floating or docked in position on the regular interface. So that's our overview of our key panels and toolbars. Next, we're going to take a deeper look at the Layers panel and the different layer types. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there.